Hi everyone. This week we'll be thinking about military rule, and we're going to be looking at it particularly in the country of Egypt. Up till now, we've been thinking about democracy, the state, and different ways in which people are allowed to participate in the state. So we've talked about democracy as a way of taking the conflicts in society and making them be resolved through a set of institutions in which it's uncertain how the conflict will be resolved, but in which everyone trusts in the result. That's what Przeworski argued, right? Democracy is a way of making social conflicts solvable in a means that everyone can buy into. Moreover, we've talked about the fact that there's a wider way of thinking about democracy, a larger way that looks at different areas of social interaction and thinks about how these areas are or are not democratic, how these areas are or are not open to be. This includes political society, so protesting, mobilizing, campaigning for elected office. It includes civil society, so sports teams, church organizations, things like this. It includes economic society, so how people are able to enter into the market and pursue economic goals. It includes the rule of law and the functioning of the bureaucracy. In all these different ways, we can think about democracy. Because if you don't have openness and inclusivity in these different parts of human existence, it's very hard to have democracy in the sense of a system where conflicts are resolved and uncertainty is inherent, but everyone agrees. Finally, we've looked at different ways in which people are included or excluded from these different parts of society. So we've looked at nationalism, we've looked at ethnicity, race, we've looked at gender, we've looked at religion, sectarianism. All of these different ways can be used to promote an inclusiveness or promote an exclusiveness. And so to understand whether or not something like economic society or civil society is open to participation or closed. For example, it would be difficult to say that a state in which participation, ability to affect the institutions of the state, was limited by someone's religion or gender or ethnicity, it would be hard to say that a state that limited participation in those ways was democratic. And when we think about democracy in this way, we see why it matters so much. Because if you're a person who's excluded from participating in the creations of a state's institutions because of some personal qualities, qualities inherent to you, that the people who do control the state have chosen to emphasize, then you are not in control of the things affecting your own life. And that can be dangerous. In other words, the state, democracy, and all these other aspects we've been talking about are vitally important. And that's why we've been talking about them for the past several weeks. Now, today we're going to switch gears and we're going to look at the military. The military is not a concept in the way that, say, the nation or gender is. The military is not a way of structuring human interactions. The military is an institution, much like the state. And often, as we'll see, the military structures, the rules of the military, are in conflict with these structures and rules of the state. And we're going to look at Egypt because Egypt is perhaps the most famous example of a military dominated society in the Middle East today and since the 1950s. So, talking about Egypt, its history, its developments, and the tensions between the military, within the military, between the military and the state, between military and civilians, all these tensions, I think will help us understand the roles militaries can play in societies. As usual, I'll start out with a little bit of theory before moving into an actual history of Egypt, and then finally I'll wrap up, as I do usually, with a little discussion of how this idea of the military relates to the larger idea of democracy. Unlike other weeks where I've started out with some definitions of what the term I'm talking about even means, I don't think it's necessary to explain what the military is. What I think we want to talk about is how does the military function? What is its political purpose? When we look around the world today or in the past, we see so many examples of military led regimes. In one of our readings, we heard about tutelary regimes, especially in the case of Turkey. That's where the military intervenes in politics to act as a guide. The military is not the only organization that might intervene in politics. You might have the Communist Party in China intervene in politics. You might have the king intervene in politics, right? And all of these different institutions or individuals are performing a tutelary function, they might say. In other words, they're guiding society to the correct decisions. They're tutoring, they're teaching it. So we understand that the militaries do intervene. We have heard of one set of reasons why they might do this. Now, what I want us to think about today are two other reasons they might intervene. So one is this concept of Praetorian regimes, and this other is the concept of milbiz. So let's look at both of those. If tutelary is a reason for intervening, then Praetorianism, Praetorian regime, is the intervention itself. Praetorianism is when the military intervenes into politics. Why it does that, there might be a variety of reasons. Being a tutor is simply one of them. Another reason might be to defend the integrity of the nation against foreign attack or internal dissent. So there's a lot of different reasons. Samuel Huntington, who you may remember from a previous class, has a large theory of why the military intervenes. He says the middle class makes its debut on the political scene not in the frock of the merchant, so in other words, bourgeoisie, but in the epaulets of the colonel. So what does this mean? Well, Huntington is saying that the military is fundamentally a middle class institution. Now that may sound a bit odd at first, but what he means by middle class is he means professionals. So not the people who work in factories and not the people who own the factories, not the people who have a lot of money, but the professional people who make institutions run, right? The clerks of the factory, the lawyers who make the contracts, the professionals. So the military is professional too. People have training. People have commitment to their institution. So they're middle class in that sense. So in societies where there is no middle class input in society, so monarchies, aristocracies, oligarchies, military enters into politics in order to promote the ideas of professionalism associated with the middle class. In other societies, it intervenes in different ways. And so he goes on to say, as society changes, so does the role of the military. In the world of oligarchy, the soldier is a radical. See, this is what I was saying just a second ago. In the middle class world, he is a participant and arbiter. So in other words, in like America today, which is a fundamentally professional middle class society, the military does not involve itself in politics because already the professionals control things. As the mass society looms on the horizon, he becomes the conservative guardian of the existing order. Thus, paradoxically, but understandably, the more backward a society is, the more progressive the role of the military. The more advanced a society becomes, the more conservative and reactionary becomes the role of its military. So in other words, as the mass of society tries to become more involved in politics, the military remains a professional, institutional defender, but in doing so, it's pushing back now against the masses. So again, military's role changes at different points. And in some of these points, as far as Huntington's concerned, the military's role is good. In some of these points, it's bad. Huntington thinks it's good when it's helping professionalize society, when it's helping make institutions more rational, more efficient. He doesn't think it's good when it's defending tradition necessarily. Now, a different but equally interesting scholar who writes about the military is Aisha Siddiqui. Now, she doesn't disagree with Huntington exactly, but she's much more cynical about the military and what it really does once it's in power. For her, the military isn't particularly a middle class institution that has the potential to make society run more smoothly and efficiently. For her, militaries tend to act in a predatory manner. They tend to turn into just another institution in society that's looking out for its own interests, and which therefore should not be entrusted with power over the rest of us or the power to act allegedly in our own interest. She says the military's economic predatoriness, especially inside its national boundaries, is both a cause and effect of a feudal, authoritarian, and non-democratic political system. So she looks at Pakistan, and she's saying that the military regime there in particular emerged onto the stage not as representatives of the middle class or something like this, but really just another authoritarian, feudal, non-democratic entity in an already authoritarian, feudal, non-democratic system. And once in place, the military tried to develop its institutions to suit its own ends. It created businesses, it started making profit, and she calls this milbiz. She says milbiz is military capital used for the personal benefit of the military fraternity, especially the officer cadre, which is not recorded as part of the defense budget or does not follow normal accountability procedures of the state, making an independent genre of capital. It is either controlled by the military or under its implicit or explicit patronage. So what's this mean? She's saying that once the military is in power, it starts taking the budget for itself, and it doesn't report this budget because military expenditure are national security, they're state secrets. But in reality, the military, just like any institution, is self-interested, and therefore it's out for its own ends, it's out to benefit its leading officers and also their subordinates, the people who depend on them for patronage. So I want to keep both of these aspects in mind because we're going to see both of them at play, I think, in the example of Egypt. So first, let's look at the history of Egypt very briefly before 1952, when the military began intervening in politics. Here we have a map of the Ottoman Empire with Egypt circled, and as you can see from this map, by 1908, so even before World War I, even before places like Syria and Iraq were taken by the British and French and turned into mandates, even before then, we can see that Egypt wasn't really part of the Ottoman Empire anymore. This is because since the early 1800s, Egypt had been run by a series of Ottoman governors who were essentially independent. The Ottomans could not actually exercise any control over them. But these governors, over time, became deeply indebted to the British, to the point where, in 1881-82, the British actually occupied Egypt to collect their debts and stayed there. The British also built a large canal near Suez, and I'll show you a map in a few minutes of that. But Egypt became a key part of the British Empire well before World War I because it helped Britain connect to the Mediterranean, connect to the Red Sea, connect all the way to India. After World War I, Egypt became independent. It became independent even before places like Iraq and Syria became independent, and it did so in a very familiar way. Just as we saw in Iraq in previous weeks, the British signed a treaty with the monarch of Egypt that allowed the British to retain control of the Suez Canal, which was important for trade, and also retain basing rights. So even though Egypt had formal independence, it could join things like the League of Nations, it was really still under British imperial control. And this created a lot of tension in Egypt. What we can see on the left here is a map of Egypt, present-day Egypt. And on the right, you can see a close-up, zoomed-in map which shows the different governorates of Egypt. And here you can see a close-up map of the Suez Canal. And as you'll notice from it, it's not particularly far from Cairo, but it separates what we can think of as the larger portion of Egypt from the Sinai Peninsula. And here's an actual picture of the Suez Canal as well. As you can see from this map, most of the Egyptian population centers, the cities, the governorates, are concentrated along the Nile and along the Nile Delta. This is the area that's rich agriculturally. It's where all the rice and cotton come from. And it leads us to a fundamental problem facing Egyptian society on the eve of the military coup. That issue was landowning. Egypt was a largely agricultural society. Even into the 1970s, over 50% of the population still worked in agriculture. In 1952, as you can see from this chart, about 2 million people, which is more than 2/3 of the population, owned less than 1 fedan of land. A fedan is about an acre, and one way to think about this is that the entire square footage of the UCSD Price Center is about 7 acres. So 1/7 of the UCSD Price Center is about a fedan. And so most people in Egypt had about that much land. The land held by these 2 million people totaled about 770,000 fedans altogether. Now, if you look down the stats a little bit, you'll notice that if you add up the 626, 87, 220, 277 numbers, and then look over, you'll see that about 2,300 people in Egypt owned the same amount, actually a little bit more, land than 2 million other people. And on top of that, 61 landowners owned about a third as much land as 2 million people combined. So this was a very unequal distribution of land. It was unequal under the Ottomans. It was unequal under the Ottoman governors who broke away from the Ottomans. It was unequal and increasingly unequal under the British. So this was an ongoing problem. British imperialism had been going on for 70 years. Unequal distribution of resources had been going on for even longer than that. So what is it that prompted a military intervention in 1952? Well, the primary issue was the creation of the State of Israel. In saying this, I don't mean that Egyptian officers or the Egyptian public were fundamentally preoccupied with the existence of Israel. Rather, the failure of the Egyptian government and the Iraqi government and the Lebanese government and the Syrian government and the Jordanian government to act in unison in order to stop the creation of Israel, stop the refugee crisis that resulted after it. The inability of these states to stop it was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? It was bad enough that the distribution of resources was unequal in Egypt. It was bad enough that the British were able to exercise their imperial control as they wished. But on top of all that, the system wasn't even capable of winning a war, of protecting Arabs, of protecting Muslims in a place like Palestine. So this loss against the Israelis in the 1948 war infuriated the Egyptian officer corps, it infuriated the Egyptian public. It led to attacks on British bases because the British were seen as being supportive of Israel. It led to attacks on the Israeli state that was created in 1948-49. And it led to a state of tension between Egypt and Israel, and a state of tension between the public and the monarch in Egypt. So, what groups in Egypt were organizing against the king and trying to end his rule? Well, in reality, there were multiple groups. On the left, you can see the Muslim Brotherhood and its leader, Hassan al-Banna. We'll talk about them in detail next week, but they were one of these groups that was organizing. In the middle, you have a civil society group called the Youth Party of Egypt. This was another group that was protesting the king, opposing the British, calling for the British to leave, calling for measures to be taken against Israel. And then finally, on the right, you have the group that we're really going to focus on in this lecture, the Free Officer Movement. These were the military officers who were plotting against the king secretly, and in 1952, finally came out into the open. The military coup was led by young officers, and just like Samuel Huntington said, These were young men from poor backgrounds, but who had become professionalized by their experience in the military. So they'd become middle class in a sense, and this made them very radical. And by radical, I mean it in the very literal sense, because radical means that you want to change something from the roots. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to change society from the roots. They wanted to remove the monarchy. They wanted to remove the large landowners. They wanted to have a society that was dominated by middle-class professionals who ruled in the interests of the population. That was what they wanted, and that's why they were radicals, just as Huntington described it. When they came to power, these young men did not put themselves at the front of the movement. Instead, they named this man in the middle, Muhammad Naguib, as the leader of the officers. He was an older general, and so he seemed like a stable, dependable leader to have in place. However, over the first few years, 1953, 1954, tensions developed between Naguib and the real leader of these young officers who you see on the left, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who ultimately removed Naguib and ruled on his own. The man on the right, Muhammad Abdul Hakim Amer, was Nasser's ally, his second in command, but also ultimately a challenger to Nasser within the system. And this is how I'm going to go about talking about military rule in Egypt. In each of the different periods I talk about, I'm going to emphasize the particular ruler, first off Nasser, but then after him Anwar Sadat, Hosni Mubarak, and so on and so forth. But each of these Egyptian leaders, each of these military officers who became Egyptian leaders, had another figure they were often opposed to who had more institutional power within the military. So what you had in Egypt under military rule is you had a series of civilian leaders who had originally been officers but gave up their military role as president. And you had these figures often in tension with the men who were still in control of the military in a formal sense. So as different leaders were trying to enact their reforms, they were always having to balance against the military from which they'd come, but from which they were now trying to separate themselves and create their own base of power. So, like I said, I want to frame this discussion in terms of military-civilian rivalry, but I put civilian in scare quotes because it's not really civilian. These people are not civilians, these rulers. At most, they're military men who are trying to create power for themselves separate from the military by which they came to power. First, however, at the risk of making this a longer than usual lecture, I want us to see some video of Nasser. So this next 5 minutes, I'm going to show you 3 different clips of Nasser speaking, and I do this because he was particularly known for how he spoke and his ability to connect with listeners and connect with people in the Middle East. So here he's going to be talking about relations between Egypt and Israel. Then he'll be talking about Egyptian relations with the United States, but really he's talking more about anti-imperialism. And then finally, he'll be talking about Arab nationalism and the rivalry between Egypt, which was representing, again, this middle-class radicalism, and Saudi Arabia, which was representing monarchy, precisely what Nasser's officers had overthrown.
What do you think are the prospects of tension being reduced in the Middle East?
Really, it depends completely on the Israeli attitude. If they continue to adopt their hostility and their hostile policy, I think the tension will continue. Mr. Ben-Gurion said one time that he wants to force a peace, to force settlement. As I can understand, to force a thing must be by strength, must be by war. As long as they are adopting this policy, there will be no easing of the tension in this area.
What is the Arab case against Israel?
Really, the Arab case is the case of Palestinians, the case of human rights, the case of those people who were driven out of their land, of their motherland, to be refugees in the other Arab countries. This is really what we feel is the most important problem. We have two problems: the problem of the refugees, the 1 million refugees, and the problem of the frontiers. واحنا بنقول ان احنا اما بنتعامل مع دول العالم بنتعامل معاها على اساس ان ما حدش يتدخل في شؤون، ولكن اذا كانوا الامريكان بيفهموا انهم بيدونا شوية معونة علشان ييجوا يتحكموا فينا ويتحكموا في سياستنا، انا بقول لهم احنا متأسفين، احنا مستعدين بننزل الشاي شوية، بنقلل من استهلاكنا في الشاي، بنقلل من استهلاكنا في البن، وبنقلل من استهلاكنا في بعض حاجات، ونحافظ على استقلالنا، وإلا نضيع استقلالنا خالص. يبقى معركة سنة 56 ما فيهاش أي فايدة. ليه أنا بقول؟ احنا بناخد من الأمريكان قمح، لازم نعرف المواضيع بالمفتوح، قمح ولحمة وفراخ، ما بناخدش مصانع والله ابدا، يعني ما بيدوناش مصانع، بيدونا بحوالي 50 مليون جنيه في السنة. احنا ميزانيتنا في السنة 1100 مليون جنيه، بنصرف على الخطة حوالي 400 مليون جنيه او 500 مليون جنيه. اذا دعا الامر ان احنا نوفر 50 مليون جنيه بنوفرها على الجزمة ولا بتهمنا والله العظيم. ليه انا بقول هذا الكلام؟ ليه انا بقول هذا الكلام؟ انا بقول هذا الكلام النهارده بمناسبة، بقول هذا الكلام بمناسبة امبارح السفير الامريكي قابل نائب رئيس الوزارة للتموين، وراح عنده مقموص وزعلان، وقعد عنده دقيقتين، وكان مفروض هيتكلموا على التموين، المواد التموينية اللي احنا بنجيبها من امريكا حسب قانون الحاصلات. وقال له والله ان انا ما بقدرش اتكلم ابدا دلوقتي في هذا الموضوع. ليه؟ لان سلوكنا احنا يعني هنا في مصر مش عاجبه. انا بقول له هنا اللي سلوكنا مش عاجبه يشرب منين؟ يشرب من البحر. وان ما كفاهوش معركة اليمن معركتنا، ثورة اليمن ثورتنا. ثورة قامت يوم 26 سبتمبر. يوم 27 سبتمبر الملك سعود كان عنده حالة هستيريا، وبدأ يبعث السلاح إلى نجران وإلى جيزان. الشعب العربي في المملكة السعودية، الشعب العربي عليه مسؤوليات. هم سموه المملكة السعودية، هو ما سماش نفسه المملكة السعودية، هو في الجزيرة العربية طول عمره نجد والحجاز. ولكن الشعب العربي هل يقبل أن يرفع السلاح ضد الثورة؟
So what do we see Nasser talking about in these speeches? Well, one thing we see is an emphasis on Arab nationalism and the idea of removing monarchies and having the Arab people be able to express themselves and have strong states and strong societies. So when Nasser and his other officers came to power, they didn't have a very clear idea of how they were going to achieve this. And over time, Nasser in particular became more associated with socialism and socialist policies. Not all of the officers did this, however. Therefore, a lot of Nasser's political energy was put into playing off left-wing activists against more conservative officers, such as the ally pictured here, Hakim Amer. Now, what sort of policies did Nasser support? Well, first and foremost, he supported land reform. So a lot of the biggest states and government land that had been owned by the monarch were broken up and redistributed. Over time, Nasser began supporting nationalization of industries. He also supported laicism, which we've talked about before, which is where the state exercises more control over religion. So under Nasser, you didn't have a new personal status law like you did in Iraq that gave women more rights, but you did have the state assume authority over religious courts. So now the state was exercising authority in areas it had not previously done. There was also increased rights for women, regardless of personal status laws or no personal status laws. In 1956, suffrage was introduced, so women now had the right to vote. There were other rights too. Very similar to Iraq, a lot of the emphasis on women's rights was in order to get women involved in the economy. So if women could go work in factories and professional jobs, things like this, it would help the economy. So there was a state interest in giving women rights in this way, just as we saw in Iraq. Also, the government, especially in the 60s, took a larger role in family planning. So birth control, setting up rural clinics to provide health care to women, especially. Why is this? Because again, in order to create a strong state, these military leaders felt that they needed to provide more support for families, because families and the population were what was needed to create good workers and to create a productive society. Also, Nasser and his officers emphasized opposition to British imperialism and also foreign involvement in general. So as businesses were being nationalized, often they were being nationalized and taken over from foreigners who owned property in Egypt. So under Nasser, there was a massive flight of foreigners from Egypt, and also people who were born in Egypt, had lived there all their lives, but were from minority communities. Greeks, Italians, Jews also fled Egypt under Nasser's rule. Finally, we also saw him talk about his support for Arab revolutionary movements. The speech you saw, he was talking about Yemen, but he also supported the overthrow of the monarchy in Iraq. He supported the opposition to the king in Jordan. He supported the opposition to French rule in Algeria, to Egypt's west. So across the board, Egypt became a major supporter of revolutionary movements that were seeking to shake up the established order in the Middle East. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, confrontation with Israel. The monarchy's inability to defeat Israel in 1948 was what had led to the dissatisfaction that convinced these officers and Egyptians in general that the monarchy had to go. So there was constant standing up to Israel, tension with Israel. In 1956, Israel, France, and England all invaded Egypt to try to take control of the Suez because Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal, angering the British. And finally, in 1967, there was another war with Israel. Just like the 1948 war 20 years earlier, the war that Egypt fought with Israel in 1967 went very poorly. In fact, whereas in 1948, Egypt had been unable to protect the land of Arab-speaking peoples outside its borders, and that made Egypt lose legitimacy in the eyes of many of its citizens. In 1967, Nasser's regime was unable to even protect its own territory, and the 1967 war ended with Israel in control of both more of the disputed area between Israel and Jordan, so the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. So a large chunk of Egyptian territory, which was very important for trade and commerce for Egypt. So this type of loss should have also ended Nasser's legitimacy. Well, not quite. What happened was that after the 1967 war, Nasser did indeed resign, took responsibility initially. But then demonstrators came out into the street and demanded that he return to the presidency and continue to lead Egypt, which he was willing to do. So he came back, he proposed more reforms, and most importantly, he pawned off responsibility for the failure not on himself anymore, but on the military, and in particular, Hakim Amer, his second in command, the head of the military. And Hakim Amer had, in this period in the late 60s, been representing the conservative tendency in Egyptian politics. It was him who was standing up to the more radical socialist nationalizing tendencies in Nasser's government. And so Nasser got rid of Hakim Amer and also then tried to reduce even further the military's influence in politics by saying, hey, look, it's the military's fault for this loss, not me. What we have to do is we have to reform the military. So Nasser was separating himself from the military as much as he could after this staggering defeat. Nasser died in 1970 and was replaced by his vice president, Anwar Sadat. Sadat, like Nasser, had been an officer. Like Nasser, he had been part of the 1952 military coup that brought these young officers to power. Unlike Nasser, however, Sadat was opposed to some of the economic nationalization efforts that had been going on. He was also opposed to the close dependence that the Egyptian military had on the Soviet Union, because the Egyptians were getting a lot of their arms, their weapons from the Soviets during this time period. So Sadat wanted to decrease dependence on the Soviet Union, still challenge Israel, and back away from some of the more extreme economic nationalism, socialist policies of the late Nasser era. In order to do this, he had to fend off challenges from the left wing. And these were represented in the early years of Sadat's administration by this other guy pictured, Mohamed Febsi. Now, the point isn't to remember all these names necessarily. The point is to remember that each of these Egyptian leaders who emerged from the military had to fend off these type of challenges. So early in Sadat's time in office, he removed this general who was the head of the armed forces and was very sympathetic to left-wing activists. And Sadat consolidated his control over the state. He did this by relying less on the military in his cabinets, in his governments, and more on civilian figures, more on intelligence services that were independent from the military. By removing figures to his political left in the military and internationally by distancing Egypt from the Soviet Union, Sadat was able to negotiate more freely in the Middle East. Even more important was the fact that in 1973, under Sadat's leadership, Egypt was able to achieve a military success in another war against Israel. Although it didn't win this confrontation, Egypt was able to fight Israel to a standstill, such that Israel was only able to win with aid from the United States and diplomatic intervention at the level of the UN to create a ceasefire opportunity. So this allowed Sadat now to negotiate from a position of relative strength with the Israelis. And I want to show now two clips of Sadat. One, just to give you kind of a sense of the guy, it's him being asked about his youthful radicalism. The second is after this 1973 war with the Israelis, and it's to give you a sense of Sadat's attitude, or at least as he presented himself to foreign audiences.
2 years later, he was back in jail.
I was accused of plotting for the assassination of some politician called Amin Osman here.
You were guilty, were you not?
Well, to a certain extent, I trained those students and those young men. This was my main accusation, that I trained them to use hand grenades and pistols and so. I trained them. Yes, I trained them.
How much pressure is on you, Mr. President? If you didn't have the pressure of the wide variety of opinion in the Arab world on you, would you move faster? Would everything be easier?
I'm ready. I'm ready to move faster. But, my friend, just give me something concrete, and I am ready this moment to start and work.
Well, what is concrete, if we may look at the very next small step?
You want to know it practical on the ground?
Exactly.
Very well. I may tell you this. Israel must move on all the fronts, on the Egyptian front, the Syrian front, the Jordanian front, the Palestinian front now. But what I can give is this: the end of the state of belligerency that has already taken more than 26 years up till this moment. More than that, I'm going to ask a third party, like the United States. The United States has special relations with Israel. And I consider myself now the friend of the United States. Well, why not the United States come and guarantee both of us?
So I like these two clips because the first shows Sadat's more radical side. The second clip shows the side he liked to project, the more reasonable side. And as I said, in Sadat's time in power, his decade in power, the 1970s, he did a number of things. As he suggested he was going to, he did negotiate a peace with Israel. So Egypt got back the Sinai Peninsula, which had been lost in 1967. And in return, Egypt started to get lots of military aid from the United States. On the other hand, by making a separate deal with the Israelis and not including states like Syria and Iraq, Sadat essentially forfeited the position of leadership that Nasser had cultivated in the Middle East. So Nasser had been looked up to as a symbol of Arab unity, Arab nationalism, revolutionary zeal. Sadat, on the other hand, was seen as an ally of the Israelis, a puppet of the Americans. And this created a lot of anti-Sadat sentiment in Egypt. Also, there was a lot of anti-Sadat sentiment because his economic opening policies had created a lot of unemployment. They'd raised prices because government subsidies were removed from products. So there was a lot of opposition to Sadat that was building during the 1970s. One way he had sought to deal with some of the economic distress was by giving a bigger role for the Muslim Brotherhood to organize. I'll talk about this more next week. Suffice it to say, Sadat thought that by giving more room to organize to a religious movement, he would undermine potential opposition from, say, communist or socialist movements. Whether he was right or not, it didn't do him much good. In 1981, he was assassinated by an Islamist organization that was furious with him for his policies of association with Israel. So under Sadat, just as under Nasser, we've seen an example of a president who started out as a military officer, coming into office and trying to create power for himself such that he can maneuver without having to follow what the military hierarchy tells him. In the case of Sadat, we saw him come into office and then immediately move to sideline the more left-wing officers, such that he was able to control things during the course of his administration. Sadat was followed by Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak, like Sadat and like Nasser, had been a military officer. But Mubarak had been an officer in the Air Force. He'd been made vice president in 1975 because during the war in 1973, during the war in which Sadat had successfully stalemated the Israelis, the Air Force had done very well, and Mubarak's appointment as vice president was a sign of Sadat's enthusiasm for this new military and this younger generation of officers. So Mubarak came into office without a lot of connection to the army, because he's from the Air Force, and the Air Force is a smaller group of people. But he has military connections, so just like his predecessors, he has the respect of the military, even if he doesn't have very strong connections to it, perhaps. And just like Sadat, and just like Nasser, Mubarak also had a challenger during this time period. This other man, Muhammad Abdul Halim Abu Ghazala, who was the head of the armed forces under Mubarak during the 1980s. And you really start to see a pattern develop here, because Nasser had been close with the left-wing movements in the country and had to push aside the military, which represented more conservative elements. And Nasser had won, and he had put more left-wing people in charge of the military. So when Nasser died, Sadat had to remove those left-wing people in the military in order that he, Sadat, could pursue his agenda of backing away from nationalization, backing away from socialist policies. So the military under Sadat was fairly pro-market, fairly conservative again. And we see this with Mubarak and Abu Ghazala, because Abu Ghazala's military also was very pro-business, pro-American. And so you once again have this kind of hangover from the previous administration that's represented by the military. And you have the president, in this case Mubarak, trying to create a space for himself. What's notable about the Mubarak era, though, and here maybe I'm being a little bit unfair, but it's certainly the impression one gets from reading, is that Mubarak did not have a particular ideology in the way that Sadat or Nasser did. He didn't seem to have a particular set of objectives he was trying to achieve, besides a general national strength. But this meant that Mubarak and Abu Ghazala, when they were sparring for control and influence of the state, they weren't really fighting over nationalization versus the free market, or Arab nationalism versus Egyptian nationalism, or any of these larger issues. Mostly what they were fighting over was power within the bureaucracy, power within the economy, and connections for their friends and clients. So the Mubarak era is best understood as a constant balancing act. During the 1980s, in particular, when he was new to the presidency, Mubarak had to balance his own authority with the authority of the military, represented by the head of the military, Abu Ghazala. Now, during the 1980s, it really wasn't clear if Mubarak would be able to maintain this balance. Abu Ghazala had very close ties with the United States. Under Abu Ghazala, the military vastly expanded its scope of activity. So the military became involved in constructing apartments. It became involved in joint public-private ventures with General Motors to build cars. The military became involved in hospitals. It became involved in tourism. It became involved in farming, building dairies and things like that. So this meant that Mubarak, as the civilian leader of the government, was losing a lot of influence to the military during the 1980s. And there were events like riots, and when these riots happened, for example, in the mid-1980s, Mubarak had to call in the military to help suppress the riots. So again, putting him in even deeper political debt to the military. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, Mubarak's also letting the Muslim Brotherhood organize, just like Sadat had, again, just to counter left-wing activism. So Mubarak is balancing all these different forces, and at certain times he gives more leeway to some and less leeway to others. So during the 1980s, Abu Ghazala and the military had a lot of influence. But finally, Mubarak removed Abu Ghazala, and in the media, a lot of these leaks started coming out about Abu Ghazala's affairs and his corruption and things like this, so quickly he was sidelined and pushed aside. Likewise, in the 1990s, as the Muslim Brotherhood started to get more and more powerful, Mubarak and his ruling party passed a series of laws that made it very difficult for the Muslim Brotherhood to win seats in parliament, to organize, or anything else. By playing different groups off against each other in this way, Mubarak was able to remain in power until 2011. There are many reasons for Mubarak's ultimate downfall, but I would point to the market or neoliberal reforms of the 2000s as a very important one. During this time period, Mubarak's government realized that in order to secure foreign investment and foreign aid, it was going to have to engage in some serious, widespread economic restructuring. This involved, for example, cutting subsidies on things like bread and fuel. This provoked a lot of opposition to the regime because people depended on these things in order to survive. The second factor was simply that Mubarak was getting older and no longer able to do the balancing act that he had been doing for the past 30 years. And to illustrate this, I want to show you 3 clips of Mubarak, one from 1981 when he first became president, another from the early 90s during the Gulf War period, and then finally in 2010, 2011, not long before he left office. There's a marked decline in his performance that I think is fairly obvious.
How determined are you, sir, to stop these movements, to prevent their existence?
Yes, we are arresting them. We are not arresting politicians at all. It's only for this crime. Those who belongs to the Takfir and Hijrah, and those who had any slight participation in this last event. We are going to be very firm with them, and we are not going to let anybody escape from punishment at all.
This Islamic group is saying that your government is repressive, that it's denying due process, that it is not permitting democracy to flourish in your
that's
country.
good. That's good. We are not with democracy, and they want democracy. Believe me, these people, whenever they take power, there will be no kind of democracy at all. They deny democracy, they deny parties, they deny government, they deny armed forces, they deny everything. So don't believe that. We know them very well. We have a very good idea about them, and the police understand them very well.
My main effort is to complete the program for the people, and I made a program, in the campaign, and all the items of the program is going very well. This is my main concern, not to renew or not to renew. I'm not thinking about it now.
When will you decide?
I would like to ask you a question. When can you decide the President of the United States? Now?
You can't.
You can?
No.
Well, we have the same.
But they're writing books now called Egypt After Mubarak. Books.
In the United States?
Yes.
America. شوف احنا
Look, we
بلد كبير
are a large country
ومستقر.
and we have stability here.
عندنا دستور
We
دائم.
enjoy stability. We have a permanent constitution. It has been amended
تتذكر
for a number of times. And if you recall
التعديلات الدستورية
that once
انت بتقولي
you asked me in one of your interviews,
زمان بس
is that the
مش
president being elected only by the parliament means some sort of incomplete democracy.
كنت مجهز
At the same moment, I was ready to propose amendments to the Constitution, and we amended 34 articles. That was unprecedented. This is in the interest of stability, in the interest of ensuring people about future. It is not a small country on which we take decisions just like that. It is a stable country, and it will remain a stable one after Mubarak and after the man who comes after Mubarak.
Speaking of that, there are those who believe that you would like for your son, Gamal, to come after you.
شوف بقى هذا الموضوع عمر ابني ما فتحه معايا اطلاقا.
This was never raised between my son and myself.
Contrary to what Mubarak said, the issue of succession was the biggest issue in Egypt at the time, politically. And Mubarak did want to have his son take over. And if you read anything about Egypt in the late 2000s, it was mostly focused on this issue of succession. Could Mubarak get his son to succeed him? His son was not a military officer, did not have military connections. In fact, his son was a financier, a banker, and was very closely associated with a lot of the unpopular neoliberal market reforms of the 2000s. So you had perhaps his son was going to succeed him. On the other hand, you have, and I have pictured here for you, his vice president, Omar Suleiman, who had the backing of the intelligence services. You also had the head of the armed forces who had replaced Abu Ghazala, this man, Mohammed Hussein Tantawi. So there was all this uncertainty about who was going to follow Mubarak once Mubarak died. And as you can see from those clips, Mubarak's ability to speak was declining over time. In fact, by 2011, it was very unclear whether Mubarak would make it through his term. In 2007, he had passed amendments, and you heard him mention these in that interview. He had passed amendments to the Constitution that made it much more difficult for the military to put forward an officer to replace Mubarak as president, and therefore make it easier for maybe his son to replace him. So by 2011, you had this building tension whereby Mubarak was trying to create a political base outside the military, sideline the military, and perhaps put his own family forward. This would be a big step because, as we've seen, every previous Egyptian ruler going back to 1952 had been a military officer before they became president. In other words, in 2011, in January 2011, when protests swept through countries like Tunisia, Syria, and Egypt, they came at a moment when Mubarak's position was particularly unstable because he'd alienated the military by this point. He'd alienated some of the intelligence services too, so he no longer had a lot of the support that he needed to maintain power. So when these protests broke out, Mubarak initially tried to maintain his control, but very soon it became clear that he would be unable to. And in February, Vice President Omar Suleiman addressed the country.
My fellow citizens, at these hard circumstances our country is experiencing, President Mohammed Hosni Mubarak has decided to waive the office of the President of the Republic and instructed the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to run the affairs of the country. May God guide our steps.
So, in January 2011, the military forced Mubarak to step down, and the military organized new elections and a new constitution, and those elections were won by a civilian candidate with no history of involvement in the military, Mohamed Morsi. Morsi was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so we'll talk about him more next week when we focus on religious politics and Islamist movements. The thing to emphasize here, though, is that the military controlled this process. They forced Mubarak to step down. They oversaw the transition to civilian rule. But that civilian ruler, Morsi, once he was in power, quickly found himself boxed in by the military, by the intelligence services, by all these pre-existing institutions that had influence in the state. And no matter how much Morsi tried, he was unable to gain dominance on them the way Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak had been able to during their presidencies. And I think part of this is because those leaders had come from the military, so they had some connection, they had some trust within the military. Morsi did not. Initially, Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood kept on Mubarak's Secretary of Defense, the head of the armed forces, General Tantawi. They kept him on because they needed his approval, his seal of approval, in order to gain legitimacy as leaders. However, very quickly they grew dissatisfied with Tantawi, and in 2012, Morsi removed him because Morsi thought that he could appoint his own general to be head of the armed forces. Morsi brought in the military figure whom he thought was the most religious, the most devout, the most likely to support the Muslim Brotherhood. That was Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. And el-Sisi was different from, say, Nasser or Sadat or Mubarak, because he had much deeper connections to the military. In fact, before he entered government, Sisi had been the head of military intelligence. In other words, he'd been in charge of the intelligence services that keep an eye on the military itself. And he had networks and connections within the military from this. When he was brought into government by Morsi, Sisi spent the first few months supporting Morsi, but over time he formed his own connections, especially with the United States government and the Secretary of Defense at the time. As Morsi became more and more unpopular over the course of 2012 and into 2013, Sisi continued to distance himself from Morsi and from the Muslim Brotherhood, and he began to present himself and the army as the only possible source of stability in Egypt. And finally, in 2013, a new set of protests emerged against Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood this time. And once again, the military used it as a reason for intervening in politics.
The address of the president yesterday and before the expiry of the 48 ultimatum did not meet the demands of the masses of the people. As a result, it was necessary for the Egyptian armed forces, based on its historic and patriotic responsibility, to consult with certain political and social figures without sidelining any party, where the meeting parties agreed upon a future roadmap plan which include initial measures whereby a powerful Egyptian, coherent Egyptian society is achieved without marginalizing any individual political party and putting an end to the state of division.
So, once again, the military organized a constitutional convention and held elections, and this time, Abdul el-Sisi became the president. So once again, Egypt has a president who was formerly a military officer. In the last 5 years that Sisi's been in power, he's emphasized his own personal piety, but he's been cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood. He's consolidated control over the state and over the military. For example, his old role as head of military intelligence, he's put his daughter's father-in-law as head of military intelligence. So he's extended his family connections throughout the state. Beyond Egypt's borders, he's tried to maintain close connections with the United States and improved relations with countries like Saudi Arabia. The farther we get away from it, the period of 2011 to 2013, in which Mubarak was removed, a Muslim Brotherhood-backed president was elected, and the military again intervened, seems like a hiccup in an otherwise uninterrupted period of military rule stretching back until 1952. Nonetheless, I think there are some long-term trends that we can talk about, and that's what I want to conclude on. But first, let's just take one last minute to see a little clip of Sisi and see how he talks and how he, compared to some of the previous people we've talked about, presents himself.
أنا اللي بشكرك، ولكن المقدمة اسمحي لي إن أنا أتكلم أنا. لا، في خريطة طريق للديمقراطية حقيقة في مصر، وإحنا حريصين على إن إحنا نحقق إرادة المصريين فيها، لأن خيار الشعب المصري بالنسبة لنا ده قمة أملنا إنه يتحقق. المصريين أرادوا التغيير.
But in Britain, there have been protests, including a letter signed by British MPs and academics saying that President Sisi shouldn't have been invited, and they've accused you of being a dictator. How do you respond to that?
في حرية للتعبير وللرأي في بلادكم وكمان في بلادنا، وهم محتاجين كمان يسمعوا مننا وجهة نظرنا ويعرفوا الواقع اللي احنا موجودين فيه.
People are looking at the realities of Egypt and they see a draconian counterterrorism law that both Egyptian and international human rights groups have described as a permanent state of emergency. Why does Egypt need that?
وفي 5 سنين من حالة ثورة بتمر في هذه الدولة. مهم قوي ان يبقى في استقرار عشان نقدر نوفر للناس ديت، بس ده مش معناه هنوفر استقرار بالقوة وقهر الناس. احنا بنحاول ننظم حياتنا بشكل او باخر. من حق الناس انها تعبر عن رأيها، من حق الناس انها تعمل مظاهرات، من حق الناس انها ترفض استمراري، لكن احنا بنتكلم على ان ننظم لبلد فيها هذا الحجم من السكان وفيها حجم ضخم من المشاكل. بالمناسبة مصر قعدت ال40 سنة اللي فاتوا بقانون طوارئ وده ما حصلش دلوقتي.
But does the law have to be so severe? Why is it necessary?
هو أنا مش هدافع عن القانون، أنا هدافع عن الحالة. وعايز أقول لك إن إحنا اتكلمنا كتير في يا ترى التجربة بتاعتنا والممارسات في الديمقراطية اللي إحنا بنتحركين بيها. وأنا رديت قلت لك إنها تجربة إحنا ماشيين فيها بنحقق فيها نجاحات، لكن النجاحات اللي بنتمناها يمكن يكون لسه ما حققناهاش. دي نقطة. النقطة التانية أنا عايز أقول لك إن أنت لو التقيتي بالمصريين اللي موجودين، المواطنين البسطاء هتلاقيهم خايفين قوي من مصير زي المصير اللي في دول كتير في المنطقة بتعرضت له. اللي بيشوفوا المناظر بتاعت الناس اللي بيغرقوا في البحر واللي رايحين لأوروبا لاجئين خايفين إن هم يبقى مصيرهم هنا كده.
But tens of thousands are in jail. That is a reality.
بس خلي بالك الإجراءات اللي بتتعمل إجراءات قانونية، مش إجراءات مش اعتقال، طبقا للقانون. احنا 90 مليون.
So what does this all mean? What does the history of Egypt in the last 60, 70 years tell us about military rule and its relationship to democracy? Well, I think that the Huntington argument we started out with is very revealing. Because remember, Huntington argues that militaries, as professional organizations, enter into politics in order to create a middle-class, professionalized society in which the bureaucracy functions, laws function, and traditional forms of power like monarchy are no longer what is running society. And we saw that. Under Nasser, we saw the military enter into politics, remove the king, and pass a large number of reforms that gave equality to all citizens, that removed, say, the honors of notables and royalty, that extended rights to women, that put the state courts in charge of religious courts, all this type of thing. Over time, however, we saw the military become just another institution in this middle-class state. And under Sadat and under Mubarak, and now under Sisi, what we've seen happen is that the military is just another interest group, trying to extend its influence throughout different sectors of the economy and different parts of society, with its own set of interests, which its leaders try to protect, and which presidents like Sadat, like Mubarak, and like Sisi have to balance against other interests in society. So what we see is the military going from being this radical agent of revolutionary change to being just another institution. And that's what Huntington means when he says that ultimately the military becomes a conservative force. And we saw that in 2011, 2012, 2013, where the military experimented with opening politics up to the masses, and the result was that this Muslim Brotherhood candidate won, which went against the military's interests. And so the military intervened again to check that type of change, to check the results of mass politics. So we've seen something happen very close to what Huntington describes. On the other hand, we've also seen something happen very close to what Aisha Siddiqa describes, which is to say, in a society that was feudal, it had a monarch, it had large landholders, we saw the military come in and become exploitive and predatory just like those other institutions, just like the monarchy, just like those large landowners. We saw the military come in. Under Nasser, we saw the military extend its power throughout society. Under Sadat, and especially under Mubarak, we saw the military become more involved in business, more involved in sectors of the economy where it had not been involved before. Especially under Mubarak, we saw both the president and the head of the military competing for influence, competing for power within the state. And we've seen that crystallize perhaps under Sisi, who has familial control of the intelligence services, who himself has deep, extensive connections with the military. So we've seen this movement by which the military becomes ever more powerful, ever more capable of extracting money, extracting resources from society to its own benefit. Officers live in big houses. Officers get subsidized food. Businesses, factories owned by the military are exempted from liberalization efforts. Businesses owned by the military receive subsidized energy. So businesses owned by the military are at a competitive advantage to private enterprise in Egypt. So even though Huntington's point about the military functioning as this revolutionary force to modernize society, to make it more middle class, we also see this other potential argument that Sadiq is making, that the military came in as predatory and has only become more predatory with time. And in 2011, 2012, 2013, we saw a moment where the military, again, experimented with opening up and then quickly realized that that was against its own interests. And now we have a crackdown and a reassertion of military authority very clearly in the form of President Sisi. In conclusion, what I think looking at Egypt shows us is the possibilities, but also the limitations of military involvement in a society's politics. Militaries are inherently undemocratic institutions. They limit entry for all sorts of reasons. The question is, can militaries contribute to making societies more democratic? I don't think looking at Egypt answers that question for us. What I think it does is it offers us a lot of events, details, and food for thought. And that's what I'd like us to discuss in class on Thursday, and what I'd like you to write your study question about. Here you go, and I look forward to speaking with you about this and other related topics on Thursday. Have a good week.